So let's take a look at some of these different types of agency relationships. And as you can see right here, there's several different types of agency relationships, right? And we've talked about most of them a little bit, but right now we're going to get into a little more detail and describe how some of these different relationships work, which ones you might want to get yourself involved with, some that you may not want to be involved with. But anyway, y'all, let's take a look. And we start with the seller agency, and obviously seller agency means you're working with the seller. This is not new. We've already kind of touched on this a little bit, but it does require written agreement. We call that a listing agreement. And when you list a house for sale, that creates the seller agency relationship, where obviously you're now representing the seller, and by law you must promote the best interest of your seller. Okay. Same thing with a buyer agency. If you and a buyer sign a buyer agency agreement, then that means now the buyer is your client, and you now must promote the best interest of the buyer. Again, that's required by law. Now, dual agency, and you'll notice it typically will say disclose dual agency. Rarely do you ever see just the term dual agency. Occasionally you do, but you see oftentimes it'll say disclose dual agency, because that's usually the only time dual agency is legal, is if it's fully disclosed. First of all let's make sure, just a review. What is dual agency? Obviously that means you have two clients, but you're representing both the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. Now, is that a conflict of interest for you to do that? You bet. There is no way to get around it. That's a huge conflict of interest. You're trying to get the best deal for both the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. That by definition is a conflict of interest. So is dual agency legal with that in mind? And the answer is, well, one, it depends on the state you're living in, okay, or operating in. And obviously, when we get into the state specific portion, we'll address this more specifically. But I will tell you, in most states, it is legal if it's fully disclosed, meaning you must disclose this to both parties, buyer and seller. You got to explain to them that you'll be representing them and the other party as well. Okay? You got to let them know that. You have to explain that to them. And as long as they are okay with it, then they have to sign a dual agency agreement, because this is what part of that disclosed dual agency is all about. Disclosed means they've signed a written dual agency agreement, which is in writing, saying that they understand what they're getting into and that they're okay with it. And now you can represent both parties. Now, under this type of agency, your duties will become limited. And we haven't talked about this yet, but there are 6 fiduciary duties that when you enter into an agency relationship of any kind, there's 6 fiduciary duties you must provide to your client. And when I say must, they're required by law. They're not they're not options nor just suggestions. It's required by law. Well, under dual agency, because of the conflict of interest, 3 of those duties are limited on what you can provide. And we're going to talk more about this here in a little bit. Right now, we're just trying to get some basic information to you. But what I want you to understand is dual agency is legal in most states as long as there is informed, written consent by both parties. You start representing both parties or engaging in a dual agency representation, and you don't have this signed off, agreed to by both parties, I will tell you, then that is illegal. That's a no-no. Okay, you cannot do that. And part of that disclosure just means you got to let them know that you are going to be limited on how much you can represent either one. Now again, you're letting them both know. You will both get the same amount of representation, but because I can't play sides here, I'm trying to help both of you out. In essence, I can't do anything for one party that's going to hurt the other party. That's basically what it boils down to. So I'm going to be limited on what I can do for either party. Again, all that has to be fully disclosed. Now, after disclosing all of this, is it possible that either the buyer or seller or both decides, I don't like this idea, doesn't sound good to me, I want you to represent me, not the other party? Okay, well, obviously then they're saying no to dual agency, so that's out the question. You cannot practice dual agency. Well, what's an alternative to dual agency? And and I'm using those terms because that's a big deal. I remember that. An alternative to dual agency is something we call designated agency, which again, it should not be brand new. We've talked about it a little bit. But this also requires the informed and written consent of both buyer and seller. But basically what you would have to tell both parties. Well, obviously, since we can't do dual agency, could I ask you to consider designated agency? And here's how that would work. Now, because I have already listed the house for sale, obviously the seller is my client, and maybe even the buyer is currently my client because they signed a buyer agency agreement, right? And by the way, you have to have two single agency agreements before you can enter into dual agency. Okay? Now, for those of you who just got confused by what I said, let me explain. What will happen a lot of times, maybe I've already listed this house with the seller. They've signed a listing agreement, seller's my client, and now I've got a buyer interested in that house. And they're okay with the dual agency. Well, what a lot of agents will do, they'll just go ahead and have the buyer sign the dual agency agreement, assuming they're okay with it, and then have the seller sign the dual agency agreement, and then represent both parties. Well, the problem is you can't have the buyer agree to dual agency if they have not signed a buyer agency agreement for you to represent them first. So you got to have a single agency agreement with the buyer and another single agency agreement with the seller. If you don't have those first, you cannot create a dual agency, much less designated agency. So don't forget to get that both parties have to sign an agency agreement saying, I want you to represent me. Now we can talk about potentially representing both parties, okay? So again, the designated is the exception, an alternative to dual agency. And this is how it would work, buyer and seller. I'm telling both of them the same thing. I will continue to work with the seller because I've already listed the property. But what we'll do for you, buyer, is the broker in charge of my company will designate another licensee from within our office to work exclusively with you, buyer. So this way, the buyer has their own licensee or subagent, and the seller has their own licensee or subagent, right? So in essence, they're both receiving exclusive representation under designated agency. So why is this considered dual agency? If they both have their own licensee, both buyer and seller, they each have their own separate licensee working and representing them separately. Well, because who is the dual agent? The broker in charge is still the dual agent, right? So, y'all, designated agency is still dual agency. It just offers the alternative that even though it's still dual agency, both parties can still receive exclusive representation because they each have their own sub-agent or licensee that's working on their behalf. So you explain all that to both parties, and hopefully they would be okay with that one. Okay? And assuming they are, then there is a designated agency agreement. Y'all have both buyer and seller sign that agreement, and then we can move on from there. But that's what designated agency is. There's the transaction broker. We touched on this just a little bit already. But if you're a transaction broker, that means you're representing nobody, right? That means you're working with a customer. If you've got a buyer, for example, they've asked you to help them buy a house, but they have not, or for whatever reason, not willing to sign a buyer agency agreement. In other words, they haven't hired you in writing, then that means they're not your client, they're your customer. And if you're working with a customer, then that by law makes you a transaction broker. Again, depending on the state you're operating in, will also determine whether transactional brokers are legal or not. Guess what? We'll talk more about that when we get into the state-specific portion of your state. But for now, you just need to know what is a transactional broker. Obviously, that means you're working with a client, or excuse me, that was absolutely wrong. That means you're working with a principal, whether it be either buyer or seller, but they're not your client because they have not signed a written agreement. Now, if they're a customer, you're a transaction broker, can you provide professional services? No. Well, what are professional services? We've talked about it a little bit, and we're going to talk about it. We're going to be hitting on this all the way through this chapter. But, would your opinion be considered a professional service? You bet. Suggestions, would that be a professional service? You bet. You cannot offer opinions, advice, suggestions, anything like that to a customer. You can only provide what we refer to as ministerial acts or ministerial services. I know we've already been over that. So what are ministerial? Just things that are administrative in nature, nothing professional in nature. But you see here on the slide, obviously it's in your book as well, on what you can do as a transaction broker. You still have to be fair and honest. You still have to account for funds. You can't steal people's money just because they're not your client. You still have to use skill, care, and due diligence. You always have to disclose adverse material facts that you have knowledge of or you know about. We've got a whole chapter about material facts, disclosure requirements there. We've got a whole chapter. We'll talk more about that. Still have to promptly deliver offers, and there is still some limited confidentiality. Now, I'm going to tell you, there's a difference between limited confidentiality and confidentiality. If it's a client, you owe them full confidentiality. If it's a customer, it's a limited confidentiality, which means basically you can't do something intentionally to hurt the buyer or the seller, right? They're still trusting you that you're going to help them. You're not representing them, but at the same time, you're not trying to hurt them either, right? So That's basically what it's talking about there. But then here's something called a sub-agency. I don't know how many states at all even use this anymore. I can tell you where I operate, it's not legal. We don't do sub-agency anymore. But they could still ask you on the exam about it, make sure to ask you what it is. And for this to make sense, I'm going to have to kind of back up and give you a little bit of a history lesson, okay? Way back in the day, I say way back, I'm in South Carolina, which is where I practice, and I will tell you, I'm kind of guessing a little bit on the time frame, but I'd say 25, potentially 30 years ago, probably closer to 25 years ago. Buyer agency was not legal in South Carolina. Obviously meaning you cannot represent the buyer. You cannot do it. It's illegal. Buyer agency was not legal. At that time, buyers operated under a legal concept or theory called caveat emptor, which you're going to see later. We're going to talk more about that. That's you got to know what this is, but you'll see it later. Caveat emptor just means buyer beware. Buyer, you're on your own. The seller does not have to disclose anything to you. You cannot receive representation. Even if the buyer wanted representation, you couldn't get it because it was not legal, which I know sounds insane today, but that was the way it was. So in essence, you could only, if you're going to represent anybody in a transaction as a real estate agent, then it would have to be the seller, because you cannot represent the buyer. It's not legal. Well, I will tell you, and again, during that time, again, we're talking roughly 25 years ago or better, not only was buyer agency illegal, the law also said you have to be representing somebody in an agency capacity. Somebody has to be your client if you're going to legally be able to be compensated in a real estate transaction. Well, obviously, the only person that you could legally represent is the seller, right? Because buyer was not legal. Well, if I'm the one working with the buyer, even though I'm not representing them, and the seller's already listed their house with another agent, well, how can I get paid for that? Well, here's how this would work. Hopefully I can show you by doing this. But let's say you got a seller, obviously, that hired an agent to represent them. And then you got the buyer, and they have their agent. Even though I'm saying the buyer has an agent, technically they didn't, because they couldn't represent the buyer. So the only way this would work, for the buyer's agent here to get paid, everybody has to represent the seller. So in this scenario, the buyer's agent would become a sub-agent to the listing agent, right? Remember, this was the listing agent. And this is what created the sub-agency relationship. Okay? So basically, a sub-agency relationship just means this. The agent that is working with and helping, not representing, but helping the buyer, becomes a sub-agent to the listing agent. So in this case, now all agents are representing who? The seller. That's what sub-agency is. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing again. But now I will say too, at least today, I think buyer agency is legal, certainly in most, if not all states nowadays. But where buyer agency is legal, which again I think is in most states, Now there's no more need for sub-agency. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, if I'm working with the buyer, then the buyer can be my client. I don't have to represent the seller to be able to get paid, because now the buyer can be my client and I can represent the buyer. So sub-agency is kind of something that you just don't really hear much anymore. But they could ask you about it on the exam, so you need to know what it is. All right? Implied agency, we already talked about that one a little bit. I will tell you, in many states, implied agency is illegal. Your implied agency is created by the acts of the parties. If you do or say something to a buyer or seller that would have them think you're representing them, even though you have not signed anything. You don't have an agency agreement signed, but you've led them to believe you're representing them just by your acts or the way you talk to them or things you've said. Y'all, that's considered implied agency. Just means that the parties believe this relationship to exist, even though it's not in writing. Okay? Y'all better be careful with it. Y'all, in fact, if it's not legal in the state you're operating, I'm telling you, probably in most states, implied agency is not legal. You could get in a lot of trouble here, so you got to be really careful that you do not create an implied agency when you're helping buyers and sellers as a transaction broker, right? You better be careful with that. All right. And then the last of the relationships we're going to hit on is this agency coupled with an interest. Now, this one is very unique, and I don't know how common this would be, but hey, it is what it is. Got to know what it is. I know that for test purposes. But when you have an agency coupled with an interest, that means not only does the agent, they're not just listing the property for sale, they actually have a personal interest in that property. They've done something or agreed to do something that creates an additional interest other than just listing the property for sale. Now, and just for example, maybe say I list a house for sale that honestly needs a lot of work done. I'm just making up numbers right now, but let's say it needs $25,000 in repairs. It just needs a lot of work, and we're going to say $25,000 in repairs, and the seller is not able to make those repairs. They don't have the money to do it. So the agent says, "Well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll pay to get the house or property repaired, and then we'll create the agency relationship, but it will be coupled with an interest. Meaning, not only am I going to get whatever the commission due for selling the property, when the property sells, I'm going to be reimbursed for the money I put into the property to fix it up or do whatever, right? So I didn't just list the property for sale. I've got a vested interest in selling this property now. So that's agency coupled with an interest. Now, what's interesting about this type of agency that I would certainly pay attention to and remember, agency coupled with an interest cannot be terminated by any party until that property is sold and proceeds have been, or the agent has been reimbursed for whatever interest they invested. Say the seller dies. This type of agency cannot and will not be terminated until whatever my vested interest is, until it's returned back to me. It's not this agency cannot be terminated for any reason. I would remember that. That's a big part of agency coupled with an interest. It cannot be revoked until the agent receives back whatever their interest was in the property. Okay, but that's an agency coupled with an interest.